going to move on to our second speaker, and that is Sabrina McCormick. Sabrina is a sociologist and filmmaker who investigates how to motivate climate mitigation and adaptation. Her recent research investigates how and why U.S. cities act on climate change, including some work here in Philadelphia. Thank you for that. And also the risks of extreme heat exposure in those areas. In terms of her filmmaking work, she's directed and produced several award-winning films, including segments of the Showtime series called The Years of Living Dangerously. And that won an Emmy Award for Best Documentary Series in 2014. She's an associate professor at the Milken Institute of Public Health at George Washington University and a senior fellow at the Wharton Risk Management Center. We're very, very happy to have her here.
Thank you, Girdhar, and thank you to all of you. Is that so loud? It seems so loud to me. For all of your hard work. I know that everyone in this room is dedicated to different aspects of this very important topic. So thank you for being here and for all the work that you do. And thank you, Anna, for the invitation to be here and to ensuring that what I think of as the most critical public health issue we face in the 21st century is incorporated into this very important discussion around the future of our cities, and that issue is climate change. I see climate change as the most critical issue that all of us are facing. It will affect each one of our areas of work, be it obesity or HIV, areas that we generally, I would say, seem distant from this overarching issue of climate change. But there is a connection, there are many connections, and it's also an issue that will affect each one of us individually in our own lives if it hasn't already. And so I hope that at the end of this very short presentation, you'll be at least thinking a little bit more about how this issue may relate to you and your work in the future. I'm going to talk about this issue of climate change by presenting to you a very, very small slice of a large-scale qualitative research study that I've done in 6 cities in the United States, interviewing multi-sectoral stakeholders regarding their work on climate change, both assessing vulnerability and preparedness, their perceptions thereof. Before I get into that, though, I'm going to show you this very fancy slide that I can take no credit for creating. This is a slide created by the Centers for Disease Control, which really begins to outline why climate change is important to human health, how it affects human health, and will help us begin to see how it may affect human health in cities. So do we have a pointer on this? Is there a pointer here? I don't know. So if you look at this diagram from the inside to the outside, what you begin to see in the center are the ecological and atmospheric processes that affect us in terms of climate change. So be they increased extreme weather events, increased storms, sea level rise, increased temperature, changes in air quality. These aspects of climate change in turn have various kinds of effects on our human health. So for example, these changes can affect vector ecology, which in turn affect rates of vector-borne disease. This is in the United States and globally. We have increasing allergens because of changing plant ecology due to changing temperature and changing precipitation, which then in turn is generally increasing allergens and asthma rates. We have changing water quality impacts that in turn affect rates of cholera and other waterborne diseases. We have, and maybe globally, this is the most pressing climate change health issue, we have changing water and food supply impacts, threatening food security, decreasing potentially nutritional loads for especially the very poor around the world. We have changing environmental degradation, which relates to forced migration and civil conflict. We have increasing, generally, both average temperature as well as increasing severity and frequency of extreme heat events. And then we have changing patterns in severe weather, so increasing injuries, fatality, and also mental health impacts of displacement caused by those severe weather events. So as you can see, there are a broad range of health outcomes of climate change phenomenon. Now, one thing that's missing from this diagram that I'm going to spend most of the rest of my presentation highlighting is the people. So what do we do? How do we act? What do we think? How does this affect how these outcomes may actually take place? Now, in cities, obviously, we're facing some of the greatest vulnerabilities of climate change, maybe first because we have so many people living in cities in the United States. It's a vast majority of people. This is also true globally and growing. Also, our urban populations are growing pretty rapidly. Also, in these areas, we have very dense and often vulnerable populations. So people over the age of 65, under the age of 5, we traditionally think of as vulnerable to climate change impacts. People who are living in conditions where the infrastructure that we have built up for decades is no longer really appropriate to the risks that we face. And so these two photographs here reflect some of these challenges to cities in addressing climate change. The photo on the top is of Dhaka, Bangladesh. I actually took this photo in the quadrant that is the densest place on the planet. And so in this place in Dhaka, you have, I actually don't know the exact number, but a lot of people who are living just next to the river, which has the potential to increase flood risk, both in the short term with storms and hurricanes or typhoons, as well as over the long term with sea level rise. And what you see actually in this photograph also are migrants. So this city leads down to the south of Bangladesh, where you have many people migrating up because of increased sea level rise in the south, which is causing salinization and reducing their ability to grow various kinds of food, rice primarily, and shrimp farming as well. And so they are heading up through this river to Dhaka, making this an even more dense environment and potentially increasing risk. The photograph below is an aerial shot of Los Angeles. And in this photograph, we see how roads, concrete infrastructure, lack of green space, as many speakers have spoken about, actually have the risk of increasing the urban heat island effect. This effect is one in which localized temperatures can increase by 8 to 12 degrees more than surrounding areas because these concrete dense environments trap heat and hold heat over an extended period of time. So clearly climate change is going to affect our health in a number of ways. It's going to affect health in cities also in a number of ways. And so the question that I have posed, or the questions I have posed as a researcher are, what are those risks and what are we doing about it in the United States specifically? So what are our vulnerabilities? How do we assess our vulnerabilities? And what are the actions that stakeholders in cities are taking to address those vulnerabilities? So the research project that I've conducted involves 65 in-depth interviews with stakeholders in 6 cities across the United States: Boston, Massachusetts, Los Angeles, California, Portland, Oregon, Raleigh, North Carolina, Tampa, Florida, and Tucson, Arizona. Now, these cities were selected for a number of reasons. First of all, for their geographic variety, their demographic variety, the climate risks that they face, and also these cities were selected as a part, they overlap with a program run by the CDC that funds cities and states to assess risks of climate change and to begin to implement policy measures around these risks. And so our sample overlaps with their sample, so we hopefully will be able to inform some of what they're doing. The interviewees who we selected for this research, they come from a snowball sample, but they're really folks working in the cities who either are at the forefront of climate planning or who you might expect to be at the forefront of climate planning, because what we're really trying to do here is to see what is actually happening in these cities. And so we selected for people who would already be taking action. The interviews were recorded, transcribed, and coded and analyzed with qualitative software, QSR and Vivo. The informant makeup crossed both types of work as well as sectors of work. So as you see on the left, those are, that's our sample from non-governmental organizations, city government, county or regional government, state government, academia, and private sources. So we've got a pretty broad representation there. And then in terms of sector, we have representatives from health, water management, planning, transportation, emergency management, and energy. And then we have a general category, which is our largest category, and these are folks who really cross various sectors. So for example, an expert from academia who might work on both urban planning and on health, like some people in this room. So we have a pretty broad representation of different kinds of stakeholders in these cities. So first I'm going to start with the bad news, and then I'll end with the good news. So some of the obstacles to action on climate change that we've identified follow in these slides. And I'll say that the quotes that I've pulled from our research are really pretty emblematic of themes that we found throughout the interviews. So first and maybe foremost is there's a general lack of understanding of how climate change affects health. And this finding supports prior survey research done by NACCHO that show that representatives in local departments of health generally don't know very much about how climate change affects health. So this interviewee says, I don't understand, at least intuitively, I don't understand the public health risks of climate change. And so this is something that we saw across cities, that there's a lot of need for advanced education around climate change risks and health. Secondly, there is a great concern about the politicization of climate change and how this politicization affects action at the city level. So this interviewee said, there are a lot of people that still don't believe it's legitimate, climate change. It's a hoax, and so we're trying to do the best at the local level, knowing that we have some limitations at the state level about how far we can go. And so in environments, in cities where climate change, there was a lot of questioning, a lot of politicization, a lot of disbelief in climate change, city-level stakeholders felt like it was much harder to take action than in cities where there was a general widespread belief or understanding of climate change. And I think this particular finding is it may be difficult for some people to swallow because the implications of it are that cities with more conservative environments and with less understanding of climate change are potentially less well prepared, and therefore the costs of climate change impacts may be greater. That's kind of the next logical steps I would take from this kind of finding. In a similar kind of vein, we found that there was a normalization of risks in some cities and with multiple kinds of stakeholders. So this interviewee said, people just don't believe, they just flat outright don't believe it. Here you have whole government systems in denial because it's insidious. It's so slow that it becomes normal over the course of time. So I'll give you a more specific example. So the city of Tampa obviously is very exposed to hurricanes. And yet they have really normalized the risk of hurricanes to the degree that climate change is not included at all in their planning. The projection of increased hurricane risks is not included in planning essentially at all. And our research shows that a part of the reason for this is that people think of hurricanes as kind of something just that happens. It's something you expect to happen, you get prepared for it as well as you can, but you don't really expect it to change that much. And so this kind of normalization of, in this case, a hurricane risk means that they're not as motivated to take action as a city where this might be a surprise risk could be. And then in terms more specifically of public health, in most cities, actually all cities, we found that public health representatives were often, they felt like they were late to the game. So This interviewee said, "It took 2 years to get some people to understand that public health had a role in climate change preparedness or planning. It was not really considered a viable player in terms of climate change activities, and quite frankly, we came onto the scene very, very, very late, and our awareness kind of was pretty late in coming." So there are really two things going on here, depending on the city. In some cases, there were other sectors already involved in climate change planning, so generally infrastructure, transportation, and energy were some of the first players in the game, and then public health folks weren't involved because either they didn't know about climate change, weren't educated, or because they were really actually actively pushed out of the planning process. Health was not conceptualized as really an important piece of the climate change story. Now for the happier news, there are several motivators for action on climate change that we discovered in this research. So one, and this is maybe something that some of us, or at least the academics in the room, can be excited about, is that local decision makers really felt like academic resources, research, educational facilities were really helpful to them in moving forward on climate change planning. So this interviewee says, "I think having the Union of Concerned Scientists and several major universities in the area is also a really big driver of change and of being able to plan for climate change. You know, the fact that there are studies that specifically looked at the city that really sort of provides detailed information as a helpful driver as well." So many interviewees talked about the need for very specific scientific information about how climate change would affect their city. They didn't want to know about general trends. They wanted downscaled data. So they didn't want, that the US, or rather the world is going to warm by 2 degrees. They wanted to know, okay, in Los Angeles, how many degrees, how many extreme weather events are we going to face, which kind? And so when there were local universities and sometimes NGOs involved, these kinds of resources provided those more localized sources of data to the city, and then they could use it in their planning. In addition, experts involved in that research were able to play kind of the role of a boundary actor, as someone who crossed the boundary between policy and research to try to motivate really institutional change in these city contexts. And then maybe, to me, one of the more interesting findings of this project is the importance of a co-benefits and a mainstreaming approach. So the idea of co-benefits, for those of you who haven't thought about it in the climate change context, is the idea that there are activities that we can undertake that both address the mitigation of climate change and adaptation of climate change. So mitigation being the reduction in the emission of greenhouse gases, and adaptation being how we actually respond to and potentially decrease the impacts of climate change by adapting to those impacts. So one specific example of this might be the creation of more green space, as a number of folks have talked about today and yesterday. So if you create an urban forest that can act as a carbon sink, so an area that can absorb carbon, that's mitigating climate change, at the same time that an urban forest can decrease the urban heat island effect, so decreasing localized temperature rise, so that's an adaptation effort. So folks in the most advanced cities, the cities that were taking the most action on climate change, talked about the importance of taking a co-benefits approach. So this interviewee said, "When we're making investments in communities around transportation, around planting trees, or managing stormwater, they're asking themselves, are we looking to make those investments in those communities that are already facing significant issues, are likely to have those issues become worse over time? Are we then making those investments and really getting a co-benefit through every action that we take?" And now this is a really important question because all of these cities are facing very strict budget environments. So there's not a lot of money for separate climate change activities. So if they can take climate change risks and understand them within the context of the other kinds of planning activities that they're involved in, that's the most effective, efficient approach that they can take. And so the co-benefits approach and mainstreaming these climate change risks into their overall planning was these were some of the more important and innovative ways that they could address climate change. So to sum up, This research finds that there's a wide variety of really previously unexamined social factors that are going to affect how we adapt to and potentially mitigate climate change. You know, we traditionally, and I think generally, we think about climate change as a set of ecological or atmospheric risks. And what I want to make sure that all of you walk away from, at least this presentation, from understanding is that the climate change is really a social problem as much as it is an atmospheric one. In fact, I would argue it is at its core a social problem. How we decide to mitigate, or whether or not we decide to mitigate, is up to each one of us individually and to the institutions with whom with which we're involved. So in this case, we see that the politicization of climate change, the normalization of risks, and institutional engagement by the health sector in adaptation and sometimes mitigation are key social factors in how well prepared we're going to be to address climate change. And that also that there are social factors that may decrease impacts, so academic resources and research, and the use of a mainstreaming and co-benefits approach. So with that, I will end there, and I'd like to acknowledge the support of the Environmental Protection Agency that funded this research, as well as the 3 students who spent years of their lives coding these data. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Yes, in the back, please.
Thank you so much. I want to ask about, you really highlighted the fact that a lot of people in public health may be late to the game, may not make the connection between climate change and public health, and the importance of that connection to mitigating and adapting. So what can we do as educators of the next generation of public health professionals to make sure that they go into the workforce, go into the public health agencies and other organizations in which they work aware and prepared?
Great question. I love that question. So if you're an educator and you're teaching public health students, I would invite you to look at your own area of research, your own area of teaching, and to see how climate change connects to it, and include, one class in the semester that addresses that. Climate change is such a broad issue. It's a class you could put at the beginning or at the end of the semester, depending on what works for you, just to integrate, at least to some degree, what climate change does or how it affects your topic of interest. I would suggest that at minimum. I would prefer, because this is my area and I want everyone to know about it, I would prefer that every public health student be mandated to take a class in this area. And so they get a much broader understanding of this very complicated issue. But I would say integrating it into learning would be the first step.
Yes.
There have been a group of deans, actually, in public health schools and medical schools, and including Howie as well, we've all signed a commitment to include, I don't know if all of you knew this, but we're committed to including, training in climate change and its implications for public health. So now the task is to work together to come up with a really good curriculum to do that in a good way. So.